Well, good afternoon, everyone. Let me just say briefly, we're all deeply concerned about the mounting complaints we're hearing about the Veterans Administration all across the country. The claims, the slowness of processing claims is something that I've been hearing in Kentucky for several years. I can also think of another example, unrelated to claims, but certainly related to service to veterans that we've experienced in Kentucky, which was that they announced a new Veterans Administration hospital to be built in Louisville back in 2006, and they haven't broken ground yet. That's 8 years between the announcement and still no groundbreaking. So there's no question that this is a department that is deeply troubled. And so I'd like to turn next to our leader on the Veterans Affairs Committee, Senator Burr, for his thoughts about where we go from here.
Thank you, Mitch. It's only been a few days since the VA committee had a hearing where Secretary Shinseki came and pled that he knew nothing about years of investigations by the IG, by the Office of Special Counsel, by the General Accounting Office, and by the Office of Medical Investigators. And since last week, the locations continue to grow. On the low side, 4 new locations that have been identified, and possibly others just today. The President this morning held a press conference through his support behind Secretary Shinseki and suggested that we couldn't know what to proceed with until the Phoenix investigation was over. That's to ignore over 5 years' worth of investigations by our lead agencies responsible for those investigations. And just yesterday, the Inspector General's report on the Veterans Benefit Administration, the second largest piece of the VA, finding that the VA has been untruthful on their accuracy rate of 98%. And the IG said it's really 69%. And many of the claims, in fact, exceed the 125-day limit that they've had. We've also learned in the last several hours that the administrator of the Phoenix Hospital, with the Inspector General's investigation on site, but prior to her administrative leave, the VA made a decision to give her an $8,495 bonus for performance last year. What we've got is we've got a situation where nobody's looking at the realities. If the President wants a timeline to work within, why don't we give him the same timeline to come to a decision that we give veterans? 14 days, we'll give you an appointment. The fact is that for us to wait until August and to ignore the volumes of investigations that we currently have, proving that there were ghost clinics, that there were scheduling fraud that happened, and just today, potentially another site in Ohio, in Dayton, Ohio. This is unconscionable that this would continue. It's not something that veterans deserve for us to wait until August or later for the Inspector General to finish the Phoenix report.
Well, some of my colleagues have already noted this VA issue is a national embarrassment, and the President's response to it is an embarrassment. He sent one person down to Phoenix, and if you compare that to the website rollout fiasco, the President spent hundreds of millions of dollars, called for all hands on the deck, and yet for something as important as the way that we care for our veterans, the President sends one person down there. So, as Senator Burr said this morning, he had a news conference, but I have to say, folks, that tough words just aren't enough when it comes to this issue. We need action, and they are looking at some specific sites around the country. I happen to believe, and I've got a bill that calls for a nationwide investigation by the IG, because I think this is not an isolated instance. This is systemic. This is an administration-wide mismanagement of this incredibly important asset that takes care of the people who lay their lives on the line for us every single day. I want to say one other thing, too, about Obamacare, because as the political poll that came out earlier this week pointed out, 9 out of 10 Americans think it's important enough to influence their vote this year at the election. And half of those people think it ought to be repealed. So if you think about this issue and the way that the administration's handling it, they continue to say that it's working and they're happy with the way everything's going. Well, the American people have a very different view, and the American people are going to decide what the important issues are when it comes to this election. And I can tell you one thing: Obamacare is not going away. And I think it's important for us here in Washington, D.C. to be looking for alternatives to that. I think the administration is living in the dark if they continue to believe that it's working, because it certainly isn't, and the American people know that.
As we continue to look for ways to make sure our veterans, our heroes, get the care that they need and what roadblocks have been placed in front of them, we're concerned also about the legislative roadblocks that have been placed in front of us trying to deal with these things on the floor of the United States Senate. In the past, we've talked about the fact that over the last 10 months, Republicans have had votes on only 9 amendments. So I looked into how it's going for the Democrats. Since last July, the Democrats have filed 676 amendments and have a total of 7 votes on those amendments. So the Democrats introduce amendments, do press releases on those, give speeches about them, raise money over them, and yet when it comes to actually getting a vote on the floor of the Senate, no votes are being held. So these Democrats are very either ineffective or they're very insincere in the amendments that they're offering and then giving up on almost immediately. It's time to get the Senate functioning again. It's time for the Democrats to tell Senator Reid that they want to have votes on their amendments as well.
Well, you know, on these veterans issues and on so many issues, the White House apparently doesn't know anything about anything until they read a news report. So it seems to me that the so-called Fourth Estate, probably more of the management of the government right now than it's ever been. Everything is news to the White House. The veterans' problems are news to the White House till they hear it through the news media. Somebody needs to be in charge at the White House, and somebody needs to start taking responsibility. You know, one of these veterans hospitals, the one in St. Louis, a whistleblower came forward, had been in charge of the mental health part of that program, says it's just not working. People don't work hard enough. They don't give people the appointments they need as quickly as you should give people appointments for mental health concerns. And I'm going to be there next week to talk to them about that. But whether it's the VA problems, another St. Louis issue, one of a handful of service centers around the country for the management of people who couldn't sign up for the President's health care plan online so they could sign up some other way. 600 people, some of them have stepped forward and said, really, there's nothing here to do, and hasn't been anything to do since October 1. But the British company that got the contract to run these 6 offices, and there's 600 people just in the St. Louis office, was already in trouble with the British government for not performing whenever they were given the contract by our government. Somebody needs to be responsible for that. Somebody needs to be responsible for these offices. And then yesterday at the State Department, they were asked if they'd received a letter from Senator Ayotte and I on Miriam Ibrahim, who's being held in prison in Sudan. And really, they had no idea, even though they'd had the letter for 4 days, and we got the receipt, they had the letter for 4 days. The problem is nobody is responsible. This is a woman who, one of her sentences in Sudan is to be flogged for marrying a non-Muslim, and the second after they flog her is to hang her for refusing to renounce her Christian faith. We don't seem to be concerned about that. She and her toddler son are in a prison cell right now, waiting for the baby to be born so the mother can be killed. And nobody in our government appears to want to say anything about it. It's outrageous, just like the Iranian prisoners are outrageous who are over there and in prison for faith. And we have vacancies at the State Department in the jobs that are supposed to be focused on these things, and we should be ashamed of ourselves.
Who would we expect to receive the most timely, the highest quality of health care in the country? That would be the military men and women who've served our country. And yet we see report after report, instance after instance, in which that's not the case. What I would have expected last week in the Senate Veterans Committee hearing with Secretary Shinseki is a plan of action. This is what our department is going to do to correct the problems that have been so widespread and so well reported. Instead, what we heard was a secretary who is mad and a secretary who indicates that we will wait for further evidence that there's a problem before we act. We've talked about Inspector General reports, we've talked about GAO reports. There's a third category, the Office of Medical Inspector. Most recently, we've heard about Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Fort Collins, Colorado, in which the VA is going to do another investigation to find out about the problems. The reality is the Office of Medical Inspector issued a report to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs about that circumstance last December. So every time the Secretary says we are going to wait until we see what happens in Phoenix, or we wait until there's another investigation in Wyoming or Colorado, it really is denying the truth of all the reports that have been done previously. And here's the point I want to make. The regulations require that the reports of the Medical Inspector's Office be provided to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs and to the President of the United States. And what I heard this morning from the President's remarks is a parroting, a restatement of exactly what Secretary Shinseki said. The President is mad, and we're going to wait to see the results of another report. Where is the action that takes place necessary to see that our veterans have the care provided in the timely fashion that they earned and deserved?
Jeff.
One of the key strategies of Democrats all these years has been to take advantage of some of the divisions inside the Republican Party. Those divisions are not playing out this year as much as they have in the previous 10 years. How gratifying is that, and how significant is that, you think, going forward for the next 6 months, that your party seems to be more unified than it has been?
Well, a good place to start in answering your question, Jeff, is that shortly after the polls closed last night, I was endorsed by the Madison Project, the Senate Conservatives Fund, Freedom Works, and Eric Erickson down at Red State. Collectively, this group spent about $1 million against me in the primary, but they all got on board last night. So I think what you see all across the country this year is two things. Number one, we want to nominate candidates who can actually win in November. And number two, everybody wants to win. And even if we have some back and forth during the primaries, I think what you're going to see is a very unified right-of-center bloc with highly credible candidates going into the November election all across America. It was not always the case in the last two cycles, but I think it's clearly the case this time.
So do you accept the support from some of those groups who have said some pretty nasty things?
I'm happy to have them on board.
Senator McConnell, Allison Lundergan-Grimes indicated that she's going to make a lot of this election against you about the war on coal in eastern Kentucky. Do you think that is an effective area of attack for her?
Well, you know, it's interesting. We took a look at the returns yesterday, and there were 21 counties in which I got a bigger percentage of my primary vote than she got of hers. Now, bear in mind, she had, I think, 2 opponents who didn't raise enough money to even file an FEC report. What did those counties have in common? Almost every one of them was a coal county. And in most of those counties, I was getting more than 70% of the vote, a bigger margin against a candidate who collectively had $4 million to spend against me than she was getting in the Democratic primary against 2 candidates who had no money. The obvious conclusion you draw is that there's a lot of resistance to Democrats in my state over the coal issue. And the only way registered Democrats in a number of those counties where there are way more Democrats than there are Republicans could express themselves was to not vote for her in their primary. The coal issue is a really significant issue in our state. We have a depression in eastern Kentucky, a depression. We've lost 7,000 coal mining jobs in the last 5 years. For every coal mining job, you lose 3 additional jobs. It's a big, big issue for us. And it's a very, you know, everybody understands who started the war on coal. It was Barack Obama. And everybody understands Barack Obama and the majority leader recruited my opponent. The majority leader says, quote, coal makes you sick, end quote. So it's a big issue in our state, and I think you began to see this, the significance of it yesterday.
Senator McConnell, there have been a number of races so far where the candidate supported by the national Tea Party group, that Tea Party establishment, has not won. To the extent that your primaries are turning out a little bit different than they have over the past couple of years, why do you think that is?
Well, David, I hate to give the same answer you I did to Jeff, but I think the goal here is to win in November. And to do that, you have to have nominees who can appeal to a broader audience in most states. And so the fact that we're having primaries itself is not troubling, provided the ultimate candidate can actually win. And I think the difference this time is that we're in the process of nominating, I hope and I believe, in every one of these contested primaries, the most electable nominee, regardless of who may have supported whom during the primary process. Thanks a lot, everybody.